Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts you. Plus, today we are talking about executive orders and their impact on California public schools and students. We've got two experts in the field to talk about that and what district leaders need to know following Inauguration Day.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Dr. Edgar Saswata, ACSA's Executive Director. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We are honored to have you with us today. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello and let us know where you're watching from. Edgar, good to see you. First show on since Budget Day. And there's been a lot going on here in the state with the disasters happening in Southern California. And now we are in day 3 of the new presidential administration.
Quite a start to 2025.
Yeah.
Some we expected. It's not everything. Consistent with I've been saying in other platforms. I do, and I saw some of it in the chat. Definitely our thoughts go out to those folks who are continuing to be impacted there by the wildfires in Southern California. Unfortunately, we've been dealing with this issue that we're about to talk about all morning. I'd be lying if I even said I have been keeping up with the news this morning. I understand that there might be some new threats down in Southern California. So the unfortunate part, I know we're still trying to come out of the worst with the existing fires. And I'll use this as an opportunity to continue. I was telling a group last week, what happens here, Naj, is we know, right? There's so much attention on a particular issue, on a natural disaster. We all kind of put that focus there for a couple days, and then life goes on. Unfortunately, life doesn't go on for all those people impacted. So we would continue to encourage folks to lend a hand, whatever that means, right? The easiest way that we've been putting out, we have it on our ACSA website, on our resource hub, is just to go and give a donation to the many philanthropic efforts that are aimed at trying to provide some assistance to all those individuals, many of them from our school community. I know there's some efforts to really target some of those in our school community. Just let's keep those folks at the forefront, even while we're dealing with all of this other stuff that is being thrown at us here on the policy and on the political end. So yeah, tough week for sure.
Very, very much so. I want to say hello to some of our viewers today. Neri Pais and Maria Thompson and Christy Espino were the first 3 up on the chat today. And the chat was going before, Edgar, you and I came on the air. So so glad to have all of you with us today. We're going to get right to our interviews, Edgar, because I think from a subject matter standpoint, there's a lot for our viewers to think about right now on day 3 of the Trump administration. I want to give a couple of details, some data points for you. According to FWD.US, which is a social welfare organization, their organization estimates that approximately 620,000 K through 12 students in the United States are undocumented. About 100,000 are waiting on a decision on their asylum application. They also estimate that schools interact daily with more than 3.9 million K through 12 U.S. citizen students with undocumented parents. And we checked in on numbers for the LGBTQ community, high school students specifically here in the United States. The Hill reports on data from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. This is data from 2021, Edgar, but it's worth noting 1 in 4 high school students identifies as LGBTQ, and those are the numbers just for those who have responded. Not necessarily all the students have responded clearly. So there are some data points, Edgar, to really set up the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, no, as we put out a statement yesterday Rafael Plasencia, our ACSA president, myself, joint statement, just to underscore, and we have been kind of channeling this for the last couple of weeks, right? Since really election day in November, that we were going to take an open approach to the new administration, that this has nothing to do with who's in office, whether it be a Democrat or Republican, that our job, as we do here in Sacramento too, is to really represent our students, our families, regardless of who's in office. But hearing some of the narratives that we were hearing prior to election day, mind you, I think we were on one of their shows when the news, I think there was a NBC report that the incoming Trump administration was going to do exactly what they did yesterday, is to maybe pull back some of the protections that were in place to at least keep some of these sacred spaces as safe, right? As safe places really intended, in our case, schools, for learning. And I think that's the point that we make in the statement yesterday, that's why we're so disappointed by the action yesterday. That here, our educators, all of our folks here on the chat and watching today, they have an obligation, a constitutional right, to serve every single child that shows up on their doorsteps.
Mm-hmm.
And to really be a refuge from anything else going out in the world. And I think this action, whether it be, and we'll get into the details about, what's the intent, are they trying to, go after students or family? It doesn't really matter, because, and we've already seen firsthand from many of our leaders that this is having an impact. That when families and parents and kids are afraid to go to school, it's going to obviously impact their learning. Right. And this is just this one little thing. And it's hard not to get a little emotional about this. Like some of this is personal. I mean, the whole birthright citizenship, we haven't talked about this, Naj.
Right.
I wouldn't be a U.S. citizen if that goes into place. My father came to this country, wasn't fully documented at the time. I was born in the United States. Right. But by these rules, it's hard not to be like kids that are like us, families that have had that struggle. And then it just breaks my heart what we're hearing from some of our leaders, even before Inauguration Day, that they were already seeing the impact on attendance, that they were already seeing that piece of it. So we could obviously go on and on. I think now it's like the messages are great. This is how we feel, which I think is an important part. I think the most important part for us as an organization is so now what? What do we do about this?
Yeah.
The environment is fundamentally changing. And I think this is why we pivoted, even we weren't planning this necessary topic until yesterday.
Right.
So what can we do to advise school leaders? This is why we have experts from DC, some legal experts, to at least right now, where can our folks, what can they tell their families? Well, I know we've been bombarded even just in the last 24 hours with text messages, calls. It's so what are we supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
Agents show up on stuff, right? And a topic that we will get into.
Just want to let you guys know, yes, we did send out a news release yesterday. If you would like to read what ACSA's statement is from Edgar and our ACSA president, Rafael Plasencia, we will put a link onto our chat so you can go ahead and read that after the show. Okay, let's go ahead and bring in our two guests right now. We've got a great panel to talk to. Josh Whiteside is a senior counsel for Lozano Smith, and Reg Lichty, founding partner of Foresight Law and Policy, a regular here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Josh and Reg, so good to have you. Reg, hopefully you can clear this up for our viewers, because there was a little bit from a couple of shows ago about the impact of federal policy. But let me ask this. Executive orders can be implemented immediately, but they're subject to injunctions and lawsuits like what we're seeing right now. However, legislation is implemented either immediately or on a specific date, and federal legislation supersedes state legislation. Am I right on all of this? What can you tell us?
I think you're muted, Reg.
Reg, are you muted?
Sorry about that.
There we go.
Really great questions, Naj. So starting with executive orders, so in order for a president to issue an EO, he has to have legal authority to do so. That really at a high level happens in one of two ways. It's either inherent to the president's authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. So if you think about just the day-to-day operations of the executive branch, for example, president also has authority to issue executive orders under the U.S. Code. In other words, Congress has granted the president in many areas the ability to conduct EOs. But to your point about their effectiveness, that doesn't mean that they can't be challenged in court on whether or not they're lawful. And, Edgar's example of the birthright citizenship EO, obviously violation of and misinterpretation of the U.S. Constitution that will be challenged as it should. Kind of looking to your second question about the supremacy clause and the ability of the federal government to displace in certain instances state laws that are either in direct conflict with each other, but that is often a very complex analysis to look at whether or not the federal statute expressly or impliedly preempts the state conflict in question. So, yeah, I think at the highest level, yes, the Constitution is very clear about federal preemption of state law. How that applies in a particular circumstance is a matter of the facts in that particular situation, and I think will be really important as we look to some of these really difficult questions about the role or not of state and local leaders and some of the immigration efforts that the president rolled out yesterday that are really, frankly, very divisive and turn back decades of precedent.
Yeah.
Josh, thank you for joining us on short notice here, and appreciate just your firm. Obviously, in times like this, our legal partners just offering advice, counsel, direction to all folks around the state. Appreciate everything you guys do. So as we've been talking about, obviously a few executive orders that touch specific. I know there was a lot of action on day one of the Trump administration, and a little bit for everybody, right? And some of the things, obviously, we were focused on what are the pieces that are impacting schools, impacting children. Obviously, we talked about the move yesterday on scaling back those regulations with ICE agents. There was also some executive orders having to do targeting, I would say, the LGBTQ plus community and designations on gender. Initial reactions, and then maybe what are the questions you're getting from the field as everybody's trying to digest all this?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think this is something that we did anticipate. As soon as we knew the election results, this is part of the campaign trail promises to talk about changing how our nation deals with immigration issues. And in particular, this administration wanted to do things different than last time that President Trump was in office, and wanted to make a stronger move on these issues of immigration and LGBTQ plus issues. So initial reaction is sort of in my arena and what I do on a daily basis. This was expected to some extent, and we kind of knew what the plan was going to be. I think now what we're grappling with is what's next. What is the next step? How does this actually become realized on a school campus where ICE agents are showing up, asking for records, asking to interview individuals? So I think that's kind of where we're looking in the future. But my initial reaction to the executive orders, when we're dealing with two in particular that I'm really focused in on, we have one on gender ideology extremism, dealing with the LGBTQ population, and talking about changes to federal forms, changes to bathrooms of federal agencies, rescission of a whole bunch of federal guidance that's come out over the last 4 years on these topics and serving these students who identify in these different ways than this administration would rather they not identify as. And so I think the next step we're going to be looking at is going to be how does this affect federal funding? Is that going to affect grants to schools? And then what's going to be the reaction of California? We assume that the Attorney General is likely going to be reacting to this and providing additional guidance. But at the same time that we're ready to see what California's reaction is, I think most districts are pushing the pause button on the LGBTQ issues because the immigration conversation is so prevalent in the immediacy of what's occurred. At the same time, quietly, the California Department of Education has replaced the AB 1266 FAQs that gave guidance for the last 10 years on how schools would serve students who are transgender and the privacy rights and the rights to use the restroom, and have replaced those with Assembly Bill 1955 guidance that just simply restates the law. So the guidance that we've relied on for 10 years for this population is gone, at the same time that we're going to get new federal guidance that is likely going to be specifically targeting this student population and trying to figure out a way to make them feel as uncomfortable and unwelcome at our schools.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, we'll come back to, because I think you made a really important point there on the LGBTQ issue and some of the action that we've been trying to be in front of here over the last year. Let me ask you a question on the immigration front first. So I was talking to the governor's office this morning. We've been getting like the question, I'm sure all of us in our own spheres been getting, like you just alluded to, okay, now what? The state, at least state officials have told us as of this morning that the guidance that we just linked there, the AG, the governor's office have put, and this is pertaining to the immigration issue, they are still saying immigration schools are generally prohibited from voluntarily granting immigration enforcement officers on access to campus, that they'll need a judicial warrant or court order, which is generally the advice that we as ACSA had been giving through people like you and other attorneys in many of these forums. They what they told us is, okay, the action yesterday was already anticipated, and all the guidance we're giving still pertains. Obviously, the caveat is also always consult with your legal counsel, whatnot. But what would you say to that piece? Because I think that's probably like question number one we're getting like today.
Yeah, and I think many districts have adopted either a sanctuary or a safe haven resolution, or they passed and adopted a specific policy on how to respond to immigration enforcement. Many have it in their board policy 5145.13, and that gives them instructions on how to respond to records requests, how to respond to if agents show up, and that's all going to be consistent with the California Attorney General guidance. That still is good. That is still compliant with California law. And ultimately, a lot of those school districts, safe haven and sanctuary resolutions and policies stated in them that they would follow federal law, that they would cooperate with ICE officials if they had a lawful subpoena, if they had a lawful warrant to be there for their request, or they had exigent circumstances. There was an emergency situation that merited them coming onto campus, and that they could communicate that to school districts. So I believe all of that will still remain in place and doesn't require any shift in that regard. I think where schools are questioning what is going to come next is if it goes beyond records requests or beyond interview requests, but actually having ICE agents in the school parking lot staking out for possible undocumented individuals dropping off their kids. I think we have yet to see how that might impact or change what we need to be putting into policy or what we need to be getting guidance from California on.
Folks, if you have questions for Josh or Reg, go ahead and put those into the chat. Reg, let's just talk broadly about executive orders, because I think that President Trump had a lot of campaign remarks about what he was going to do. And now on day 3 of his administration, we've already seen him try and dial back the sensitive areas. We've already seen him go on the attack of our LGBTQ plus community. What's the tenor in DC right now? What are you hearing on Capitol Hill and from those in your federal advocacy community?
Yeah, as Josh pointed out, I think we've expected for weeks that this executive order strategy was coming, with reports of, hundreds of EOs. And it's obviously a very divisive and confrontational strategy that this White House has adopted. So it's really created a tone that is, certainly not conducive to bipartisan work. But I think it is one that we're kind of finding is crystallizing opposition, not only within the education community and the community of advocates that are, here working on behalf of kids and families and schools, but, I think we're beginning to see kind of clear recognition on Capitol Hill about what it's going to take to be a strong voice pushing back against especially those elements of this that are, I think, unlawful. It's created a very negative environment. And again, it's not one that's going to help create, productive policy making in a Congress that's very closely divided. And I would say some of these things, many of these things we have seen, even pushback within the Republican caucus on some of these school-facing EOs. So just goes to show how tough it's going to be in a House that only has 217 Republican members, just how hard it's going to be for them to move anything in some of these areas, which is reassuring. But I think we've got to stay focused as a community on the issues that are most front and center. And I think these, direct assault on the rights of LGBTQ kids and, our immigrant families have to be very high on the list.
Joshua, you can see in the chat we're getting quite a number of questions.
Quite a number of questions
about ICE agents, whatnot. So I'll give you a chance to reiterate a piece of what you said. I know we had also a question about the board policies that you were citing. But Jenna, I'll try to just group these together. I mean, I think we've gotten some question for Bernardo ask about what if ICE agents are in the parking lot. I see Heather there, whether they have the warrant. There was a couple questions about ICE agents having to identify themselves. So I know obviously these always have the particulars matter, but what general advice, guidance on just the theme of what we're getting here from the chat? Oh, no, I think we got you on mute, Josh.
All right, thank you. So I think this would be a good time to bring up the news from this morning, which was that the Department of Justice released a memo to prosecutors. And what it said in that memorandum was that the supremacy clause is still law, and that this means that the Department of Justice is giving direction to prosecutors to say that prosecute state and local officials for non-compliance with immigration-related commands. This is consistent with existing federal law that talks about it's unlawful for a person to willfully resist, oppose, impede, or interfere with any officer of the U.S. government discharging their duties. And it's also federal law to prohibit any person from intentionally concealing, harboring, or shielding what the law calls an illegal alien from detection, where that alien's unlawful immigration status is known. And so even though districts don't collect this immigration information, that's been the law in California for many years now, and immigrant students have a right to go to school regardless of their status or their parents' status under the U.S. Supreme Court case Plyler versus Doe. This is still something that it looks like the federal government is giving direction to its prosecutors to say, we are going to investigate and we are going to respond if there are school site staff that are not responding or ignoring clear directives, clear warrants that are lawfully issued from ICE agents or Border Patrol. And so that is something that I think we as a community, as an education community, need to grapple with the reality of that circumstance and what that does mean for our frontline school site workers, for our superintendents, and for our boards that are going to have to look at this really hard in terms of following federal law and complying with those directives, but also calling legal counsel to make sure that they are indeed lawfully issued directives and warrants that they're receiving from these individuals that show up.
Yeah, you're underscoring a point that we were going to make, because I know there's in the news, we're also seeing that there's some county sheriffs who are essentially saying that they're not going to enforce, federal law as it relates to many of these executive orders. But what you're saying is the federal administration has already kind of preempted that by it's almost a warning, right? Like that we expect that government officials, public officials, school districts being a public entity, that they expect that they're going to adhere to the federal law, right? Which it does put everybody in a very tough spot. I do appreciate what you said, and I know we have a lot of members of our community here, of our ACSA members, who are going to say, like, no, I understand, and I'm going to do this eyes wide open, that we are still going to abide by our procedures we have in place, whether we asking for those warrants, labeling areas where people can come into. I think this is probably the toughest part of this conversation. I think we had a question at one point where it's like, when push comes to shove, what happens? Well, it's really going to depend how aggressive the federal enforcement is on that end, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly drawing a line in the sand, right? And they're saying, this is what we expect. And if you don't comply, we're not only going to investigate, we're going to make it urgently investigated. And then we're going to follow up with prosecution. So that's the tenor, that's the commands that are being given internally in the Department of Justice. And there's even the memorandum yesterday talking about, removing that Biden era 2021 memo on schools as protected areas. It's not just schools that were previously identified as protected areas, but any places where children gather was the phrase that was used in that 2021 memo that's now been rescinded. So clearly, whether it's a field trip, whether it is a child care after school program, all of these things are now on the table for agents to show up and to say, we want to be here, we want to give a warrant. And, push comes to shove, it's going to be the federal government saying that their federal directives are the law of the land. Their federal laws regarding not opposing or interfering with federal agents is the law of the land. And then there's going to be the other side that's likely going to file lawsuits and injunctions saying, what about Plyler versus Doe? What about a immigrant child's right to public education? That's been precedent setting since the 80s. Mm-hmm. And is that going to circumvent the executive orders and the federal directives coming about? And that's going to be something that potentially our Supreme Court will be resolving.
Naj, before you go to the next question, I think this is what Josh said actually triggers one. We've also at ACSA been anticipating some of these actions, and we've been hearing from some of our members. I see it in the chat that they're getting calls from parents about not wanting to send kids to school and whatnot. And I think we've been careful about that advice, because at the end of the day, given what Josh said, we can't ultimately protect even the state. I know they're going to try to put some protections in place, but ultimately it's going to come down to the federal government and agents to see how much they're going to push about where does the authority lie, right? With that said, I think the one thing that I think is worth pointing out, that we are working with the governor's office, with the state legislature, of knowing that this impact is going to have, probably a disproportionate impact on things like attendance, on enrollment in some areas. What flexibility can we think about, can we give to our folks as they're going through this? So what we're seeing, obviously this is anecdotal, but I think at ACSA we're going to be asking for folks to keep talking to us. What are they seeing in terms of the net effect here of folks not going to school? What are they seeing as a result as these things get rolled out on the day-to-day? I think we lost you, Naj, no?
See, there we go. I was taking a drink of water and I forgot to unmute myself. I'm going to combine a couple of questions, and Josh and Reg, I'll have you both respond to this. David only asks a very similar question to what I think is Livermore asking. If agents produce a warrant, this one's from David, or order at a school site and we want to consult legal, are we provided reasonable time to do so? And then Livermore, I believe, asks how we'll be able to vet the authenticity of any warrants or legal documents that may be presented. Okay, so Josh, tell us about verification of authenticity of the warrants and legal documents. And then Reg, I know you and your team have been back and forth with us this week about, how are we analyzing some of these executive orders and how are we responding? Part two of this question, I'll have you respond to that, is what can districts do about communicating out when something like this is taking place? Not just to the parents and to the staff, but also just the community in general. So Josh, I'll have you respond first.
Yeah, I mean, I sincerely hope that they will give you a reasonable amount of time to consult with legal counsel, verify their identification, make a copy of that identification, make a copy of the documentation, the warrants, the circumstances, explanation of the circumstances that's leading to them being on your campus. I suspect, though, that we might see, not a lot, but potentially somewhere in the nation, that there might be agents that get overzealous with this newfound power and might move quickly and demand quick answers and quick reactions in order to instill fear, in order to instill worry and concern, and hope that people make a mistake. I hope that that's never the case. I hope that doesn't ever happen. And I hope instead it's a lot of professional reactions and professional interactions with our school site staff who are just learning. This is a whole new game. This is a new playbook. This is not 2017. This is not 2011 anymore. This is a new world. And I think the reality is still yet to be grappled with and understood, because I think the agents themselves don't quite know yet how they're going to be acting on schools going forward, based on the state of the nation's emergency that has been identified in these executive orders.
Since we're on that, and then we'll go to Reg. Scott asked about the federal courts. Whether do they have to go through federal courts? So can you just confirm that, Josh?
Yeah, so there's going to be what are called administrative ICE warrants, where they don't have to go through a judge, but it is an agency from ICE. That's a warrant that they are providing themselves, based on their own findings, their own determinations. And then there are separately going to be judicial warrants, which do go before a federal judge and are signed off by the judge. And those will definitely be a lawful document that's going to have to be responded to fairly quickly, versus the ICE administrative warrant might take a little bit more time to fully understand the nature of the request.
Right. Anything to add on that piece? And
yeah.
I'm sorry, Edgar, was that a question?
I'll pivot. Let me pivot here for a second. We'll come back to the immigration issue here in a second. Let me switch tracks just for a moment. On obviously, we've been focusing a lot about these actions, and I think it's what's literally at the doorstep of our school officials. It goes without saying that folks, students, families, even some of our staff around the country in the LGBTQ community are also facing a lot of fear given some of these early executive orders. I know there's probably more to come, and I know anybody that paid attention to the Trump education plan, there was a lot in there about gender and restrictions, and you mentioned curriculum and ties to Title I funding early on, and we're going to try to focus on what actually has happened just again on these early executive orders. I know there's been some references to the use of gender and identifying only male and female as it relates to schools and education. Any early insights on what that may mean for this community?
Well, I think it means a lot. I think we have a couple strands of, work here on how they've approached this. The first is to take a really, I think, incorrect interpretation of the Supreme Court's Bostock decision in 2020, that was clear about the rights of, associated with a child's gender identity. And then, this second effort that the president has included in the executive order, stating this sort of sweeping policy around, the determination, the biological determination of an individual at what they called conception. And I think, these efforts coupled with their executive orders attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including today putting all federal employees that work in DEI offices on leave, is just a signal of what's to come from this administration down into state and local government as well. But again, what is the president's authority to take those steps? I think they've grossly overstepped here. And I think as a community, we have to stand up and be very clear about the harms to students that will follow if these executive orders become kind of law of the land.
Mm-hmm. Josh Whiteside, Senior Counsel for Lozano Smith, and our good friend Reg Lichty, founding partner of Foresight Law and Policy. We've had a lot, Josh and Reg. Thank you guys so much for being with us, and we'll have you on next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And I do want to make mention of this because we've had a tremendous response in our comment section, Edgar. We've seen those questions from Ruth and Pedro and Heather, Tracy Unified, so many of them. You've given us a bit of a blueprint here, Edgar, of the questions that are out there from our members, from our participants. It behooves us to get those questions to our legal counsel. So a promise from us, Edgar, we'll get those questions answered and put them on our ACSA Resource Hub. Yeah,
like I mentioned, we're in contact with the Attorney General's office. We're in contact with the Governor's office. I mean, I think we've gotten quite a good blueprint here about where are things that are on people's mind. I know we will be in contact with them and see, can we take just some of the general themes here. I know people, especially at this moment, because they're looking to them as school officials on like, okay, what do I do now? And this is the tough part, right? It's the tough answer is to tell that we don't have all the answers today. You know, I do think that it's prudent on our school officials to go and let's rely on the things that we do have in place now, like the AG guidance, which I know we've put there, the Governor's office, they put out there. I think folks are bringing up the Immigrant Resource Center, which I know the state is working with too. I know we've had some interactions with. So we're going to try to put that out. But I think especially some of these nuanced pieces, what do I do? What do I tell my principals? What do I tell my teachers? What do I tell my parents? I think this is a commitment from ACSA that there's more that we can do on our end as this develops, to try to give folks as much of these scripts, as much of these FAQs. What do I tell my community? This is going to be quickly moving, but just know that ACSA is all departments, all efforts are to try to get as much information to our folks as possible. And then also on what Reg was just talking about, I think it's fair to say that there is this attack now on inclusivity, right? LGBTQ community, this whole attack on the DEI effort. I think we're just starting to see what that may mean for our schools. I know on the advocacy end and working with many of our partners, that also will be a priority for us here moving forward, to make sense of what is the impact, first of all, and then now what do we do about it on the advocacy front?
Yeah, and I want to point out, Abra Evanoff asked the question, resources that we can provide to support us and families and students. We already talked about what we have on the ACSA Resource Hub, but there's a link to it in the comment section, content.acsa.org.
I see some questions. I see also some asks for some model resolutions and whatnot. We've also been working with the California School Board Association. So I see, I think there's going to be no shortage of some of these, whether it be documents, resource guides, FAQs. And this is a reminder, as much as we've all been preparing for what day one of the administration may mean, I think even then, and I think, like you said, all of this guidance that you're seeing is in response to what's coming out in the last couple of days. Undoubtedly, there's going to be the need for more, and we'll continue to push on those efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. Continue to beef up the ACSA Resource Hub with this type of content and information. And as I said at the close of our interviews with Josh and Reg, we're going to take the questions that you guys had in our chat and send those over to our legal partners and get some answers for you ASAP. And of course, if you want to go back and watch this show, even though we're live right now, it is recorded. So the moment we're done, you can go back and watch, listen, send this around to your district leaders, your superintendents, so they have the opportunity to hear from our two experts in the field. Folks, if you like what you've seen here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we remind you to join us here Wednesdays. We are live and interactive, 1 p.m. Wednesdays. Again, if you like what you've seen, go ahead and like and subscribe to us on Facebook and YouTube. You'll get an instant alert when we're about to come on with breaking news. And then a reminder for our regularly scheduled show. If you have great stories happening in your school community, we want to tell those stories. Go ahead and send your talking points, your photos, your news releases to Michelle Carl, our EdCal editor, mcarl@ACSA.org. Behind the Bills, our podcast with Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations, Ivan Carrillo. His guest in the next edition of Behind the Bills is Senator John Laird, California Senator John Laird. He is going to talk about the budget, talk about some of the executive orders that are out. You can go ahead and scan those 2 QR codes. Behind the Bills available on Apple Podcasts. And you have the chance to win a $200 Amazon gift card by rating, reviewing, and subscribing to Behind the Bills wherever you get your podcast. Send a screenshot of your review to behindthebills@ACSA.org along with your name and contact information. All right, Edgar. We are well past the bottom of the hour here. If there's one thing I think that is clear, there are a lot of questions out there. There's a lot of concern out there. This is going to be a topic we're going to have to keep going back to.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think it strikes me. I think of all the things we heard. I'm really empathetic for what our members having to go to. Right? What do I tell? What do I tell, or what does my staff tell a parent who calls, who sees their school as a safe place, that you don't have to think twice about sending your kid, and knowing that at the end of the day, they're going to come back to you, that they're, that their family's safe dropping those children off, right? And it puts our folks in such a tough place fundamentally of what we strive for schools to be. And it's a sign of the times, unfortunately. One, I think, as we often try to do here, is try to hang on to hope that this is, as many things, this is the first. We say this about the budget. We say about so many things we talk about on the show. This is where we're at now, right, Naj? And I know just if what we're seeing here is an inkling of hopefully this groundswell of like pressure, advocacy to try to retain some of that protection that we really strive schools to be. Just know that there's no bigger focus for us as an organization, given what we're seeing here in the chat.
Yeah. You've said it so many times, Edgar, take a breath, but this is happening to us in real time. So we will, gather, stay together. I'll obviously invite you to come back and watch us here on the lunch break. And that is all for today's ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. A reminder, we are live and interactive Wednesdays here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.